You think the deepest pain in love is betrayal, but that belief is too simple for something as complex as human attachment, because the real suffering often begins long before anything is confirmed, long before anything is said out loud, and sometimes even before anything has actually happened in a factual sense. And what breaks a person is not always the event itself, but the slow erosion of certainty, the gradual loss of emotional clarity. When someone who once felt close begins to feel distant in ways you cannot fully prove, but cannot fully ignore either, and you find yourself caught in a mental conflict between what you feel and what you can explain. And that tension becomes exhausting because the human mind is not designed to live in permanent ambiguity. It seeks patterns, meaning, reassurance. And when those are missing, it starts filling the gaps with assumptions, fears, and internal narratives that may or may not reflect reality. And that is where emotional distress deepens, not necessarily from facts, but from interpretation under uncertainty. In the beginning, everything feels stable enough that you don't question much. There is warmth in presence, comfort in routine, a natural flow in communication and closeness that doesn't require analysis. But over time, subtle changes begin to appear, and they rarely arrive in dramatic forms. Instead, they show up in tone, timing, energy, responsiveness, and emotional availability. And because they are small, the mind tends to dismiss them individually, yet collectively they start to form a pattern that feels different from what you were used to. And this is where confusion begins, because you remember how things used to feel, and you compare that memory with what you are experiencing now, and the gap between the two creates emotional friction that is hard to ignore even if nothing explicit has been said. You might notice conversations becoming shorter, not necessarily cold, but less immersive, as if attention is divided or not fully anchored in the moment. And physical presence does not always guarantee emotional presence, which is one of the most difficult realizations in relationships, because someone can still be there, still speak, still interact, yet something essential in the connection feels reduced. And when you sense that, your mind tries to find reasons that are less painful than uncertainty, so it reaches for explanations like stress, fatigue, personal issues, external pressure, anything that restores emotional comfort, because accepting ambiguity is harder than assigning a cause, even if that cause is uncertain or incomplete. As this continues, your awareness becomes more sensitive, and you begin noticing shifts in energy more quickly, like the way someone enters a room, the way they respond to affection, or the natural rhythm of closeness that once felt effortless. And when those rhythms change, even slightly, it creates internal dissonance, because emotional bonds are built on repetition and predictability. And when predictability weakens, the nervous system reacts with alertness, not necessarily because something is wrong, but because something is different. And difference itself triggers evaluation, reflection, and sometimes anxiety. In many cases, the most painful part is not knowing whether the change is temporary or meaningful, because every relationship goes through fluctuations, moments of distance and closeness, emotional highs and lows. But what creates lasting uncertainty is when those fluctuations stop feeling cyclical and start feeling directional, as if the connection is not just changing temporarily, but shifting into a new form that you are not fully part of anymore. And that perception alone can create emotional heaviness, even without concrete evidence of anything specific. At the same time, human behavior is complex and rarely communicates one clear message at a time, which means people often express internal emotional states indirectly, sometimes through withdrawal, sometimes through increased sensitivity, sometimes through overcompensation, and sometimes through inconsistency. Not because they are trying to send signals, but because internal experiences naturally leak into behavior in subtle ways. And when you are emotionally invested in someone, you become highly attuned to those subtle changes, sometimes more than you even realize. And that heightened awareness can be both insightful and overwhelming. There are moments when emotional distance feels like silence, not in the literal sense of not speaking, but in the sense that interaction loses depth, where responses feel automatic rather than engaged, and shared moments feel less emotionally synchronized. And that lack of synchronization is often what people interpret as disconnection. Because connection is not just about presence. It is about mutual emotional alignment in the moment. And when that alignment weakens, even simple interactions can feel slightly off, like two people moving in the same space but not fully meeting each other internally. And yet, in contrast to emotional distance, there can also be moments where behavior becomes unusually warm, overly attentive, or emotionally heightened. And this contrast can be even more confusing than distance itself, because sudden intensity disrupts the expected emotional baseline, and the mind struggles to understand whether this is genuine reconnection, emotional compensation, or simply a temporary shift in mood. And without clear communication, interpretation fills the void, often incorrectly or incompletely, which adds another layer of uncertainty. As emotional complexity builds, intimacy can also begin to feel different. Not necessarily absent, but less emotionally integrated. Where physical closeness may still exist, yet emotional presence feels inconsistent, as if one person is more internally engaged than the other. And this creates a subtle but powerful sense of disconnection that is difficult to describe but easy to feel. And when people cannot articulate what they feel, they often either withdraw internally or try harder externally, hoping increased effort will restore what feels lost. But emotional connection does not always respond to effort alone. It responds to understanding, communication, and mutual emotional presence. Another layer of this experience often shows up in how time and availability are managed, where plans become less predictable, responses take longer, and explanations for absence become more frequent. And while life is naturally complex and everyone has responsibilities, what creates emotional strain is not occasional unavailability, but inconsistency without clarity. Because when connection is strong, even busy lives tend to maintain a certain rhythm of reassurance. And when that rhythm disappears, uncertainty replaces it. And uncertainty is one of the most emotionally draining states a person can experience in attachment. Over time, communication itself can begin to lose transparency, not necessarily through intentional avoidance, but through emotional misalignment, where explanations do not fully satisfy internal questions, and conversations begin to feel like they are addressing surface issues rather than underlying emotional reality. And in that space, people often start to feel like they are interpreting more than they are truly connecting. And interpretation without clarity eventually leads to emotional fatigue, because the mind is constantly working to resolve something that remains unresolved. The turning point in situations like this is rarely about finding a single answer or confirming a single assumption, but about returning to self-awareness. Because when emotional uncertainty becomes persistent, the most important anchor is not speculation about the other person's intentions, but clarity about your own experience, your own boundaries, and your own emotional well-being. And that requires the ability to observe what you feel without immediately turning it into accusation or denial, to acknowledge discomfort without escalating it into assumption, and to recognize patterns without letting fear fully define interpretation. Because the real danger in emotional uncertainty is not always what is happening externally, but what it does internally, how it slowly shifts your attention away from your own stability and places it entirely on trying to decode someone else's behavior. And when that happens, your emotional center moves outward, making your peace dependent on interpretation rather than clarity. And that is where people often lose themselves. Not because of what the other person is doing, but because of how long they remain in a state of unresolved confusion. And so the most grounded response to emotional confusion is not control, not escalation, and not assumption, but clarity. The willingness to see situations as they are, rather than as you hope or fear they are, and to respond from a place of self-respect rather than emotional reactivity. Because relationships cannot be stabilized through anxiety or overanalysis. They are stabilized through communication, honesty, and mutual emotional presence. And when those are not present, the only thing you can truly protect is your own clarity and dignity. In the end, the deeper lesson in all of this is not about suspicion or certainty about others, but about the importance of not abandoning your own perception, of trusting what you consistently feel without rushing to distort it into either denial or paranoia. Because emotional intelligence is not about assuming the worst or the best. It is about seeing clearly, staying grounded in reality, and understanding that your peace should not depend entirely on decoding someone else's silence, but on maintaining your own inner stability even when external clarity is not immediately available. And that is where real strength begins, not in controlling outcomes, but in refusing to lose yourself in the uncertainty of them.